The purpose of tonight's meeting is really to receive public input on the subject of achieving zero harm, zero death, and really an examination of less lethal use of force options with a focus on the possible expansion of conducted energy weapons, CEWs. I'd like to take just a moment just to remind people of the background. CEWs have been in use of police in Ontario since 2002. In the Toronto Police Service, only frontline supervisors and officers who are members of tactical units, hostage rescue teams, and containment teams are permitted to carry CEWs. Several years ago, the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services initiated a review to explore the advisability of expanding deployment of CEWs. The review included an examination of current medical literature, jurisprudence scan, and consultation with stakeholders, including police and civil liberties advocates. In 2013, following the conclusion of this review, the ministry decided to lift the existing restriction and allow police services to determine which officers should be permitted to carry CEWs based on their local needs and circumstances. As part of this decision, the ministry placed an explicit emphasis on openness in policing and accountability measures, enhanced training, and increased reporting, as well as the importance of de-escalation techniques and working with our community partners. And as I mentioned, in September 2013, the Police Services Board, through its Mental Health Subcommittee, met, I think, for about 5 hours at City Hall and took deputations. And at the board meeting that followed the discussion, that input, there was a healthy discussion, and the board decided at that time not to expand the use of CEWs. So this is the same type of process. There will be no decision made tonight. We'll start with the Toronto Police Service, and I'll ask Superintendent Peter Lennox to coordinate and introduce his colleagues. But we'll start, and the board asked specifically that the service address the full scope of less lethal use of force. Recognizing that CEWs are one of the prime focuses and that many other services have expanded usage of it, the board wanted to make sure that we heard a variety of options. And so, Peter, I take it you will bring us through that, and the paper talks about that. After that presentation, we will then have the deputations, and again, I will remind people that we will go through as quickly and as precisely as we can, giving everybody the 5 minutes, but stick to the topic because we really do get thrown out of here at 10 o'clock, whether you're the police or not. So with that, Peter, I would ask you to introduce your team and make your presentation.
Thank you, sir, and good evening, everyone. I'm Pete Lennox. I work at the Toronto Police College. I'm going to introduce a number of speakers from the Toronto Police Service perspective, starting with Mr. Ron Bain, Dr. Peter Collins, Ms. Dilnaz Garda, and then Deputy Chief Barb McLean and Sergeant Darren Sutcliffe, who's a member of the Police College staff, will come up and each give a brief presentation, about 8 minutes each, on an element of what we're here to talk about tonight. The first person I'm going to introduce is Mr. Ron Bain. Mr. Bain is the Executive Director of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, which is the voice of Ontario's police leaders in First Nation, federal, provincial, and municipal police organizations. The OACP has communicated the positions of police chiefs and leaders to the Ontario government over many years and in many subject areas, including conducted energy devices. Mr. Bain.
Thank you, Superintendent Lennox. Chair Pringle, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. As I was introduced, I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, and I am a retired Deputy Chief of Police in the province of Ontario. Joining me this evening is Mr. Joe Couture, who is our Director of Government Relations. And we are here on behalf of our President of the Association, Chief Brian Larkin. Chair, I've provided to you and your colleagues on the board a copy of our presentation. Given the time constraints. I won't go through every bit of it, but we thought it's important to provide you a fullness of a report for the record.
Thank you.
The purpose of this document is to offer a provincial overview for this public consultation with respect to the expansion of conducted energy weapons. Most of my comments will be with respect to the expansion of CEWs, not the full range of other use of force options. We'll gladly provide that at some future date if it's required. As the voice of Ontario's police leaders, we have a strong interest in seeing that the police services carefully consider the implementation of all use of force options and tools that allow our officers to keep not only themselves but their citizens safe as possible. I should mention that our board of directors is a very diverse board, representation from across the province. We break the province into 6 zones, and each zone is represented by a director. Toronto Police Service has its own director. Chief Saunders sits as a board member, as does the Ontario Provincial Police Commissioner, sits as a board. We have representatives from First Nations Police and the RCMP, a very broad range. We're supported by over 26 working groups in our organization that have specific portfolios and mandates that support our work. So that's who we are. The OACP believes that every police service in Ontario polices by consent. This means that all organizations and their personnel as public services must secure the trust and confidence of the members of the communities that they serve. All police personnel are entrusted by the community with extraordinary powers to enforce laws passed by governments. Any kind of use of force by the police is highly regulated by legislative instruments, such as the Criminal Code of Canada, the Ontario Police Services Act and its supporting regulations, as well as various policies and procedures and practices at a police service level. Police officer training specific to use of force is extensive and consistent, primarily delivered through or mandated by the ministry through the Ontario Police College. We recommend that the Toronto Police Services Board, in fact, we commend the board for considering, again, the expanded use of CEWs for the Toronto Police Service. The OACP very clearly has always supported less lethal force options be made available to Ontario's police services. The broad use of force continuum used by law enforcement, approved by the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services, range from the physical presence of an officer to the use of deadly force. CEWs are just one of the various options on this continuum. Ontarians want to have their police officers to have various use of force options that are appropriate to the situations that they find themselves in carrying out their day-to-day duties. These situations are dynamic and require not only a variety of options in order for an officer to respond appropriately, but this also requires extensive training. While verbal de-escalation remains the primary goal of less lethal options, CEWs are recognized as an important less lethal options that officers should have. As an intermediate weapon, like pepper spray and impact weapons, a CEW is used in situations where there is an imminent need for control and other options have been ruled out by the officer, who must assess the totality of the situation in each and every case. It needs to be noted, and the OACP acknowledges, that there is risk associated to any use of force used by an officer. The threshold level for use is assaultive. According to the Ministry of MCSCS, the use of force guideline, an officer is allowed to use a CEW if the officer believes a subject is threatening or displaying assaultive behavior, or taking into the account the totality of the circumstances, the officer believes there is an imminent need for the control of a subject and the officer believes it's reasonably necessary to use a CEW. These guidelines are specific, and the training is in accordance to that regulation. As the chair pointed out, the ministry first approved the use of CEWs in Ontario in February 2004. The OACP has long supported the deployment of CEWs for Ontario police personnel, including frontline officers. Over the years, the OACP has passed a number of resolutions it's provided to government to support that. In the report, I provided you the detail of those, and you'll see our resolutions attached as an appendices. In addition, in 2008, the OACP issued a report entitled Report on Conducted Energy Weapons. This report provided a series of recommendations to government to build a case for provincial changes to allow police personnel to have access to CEWs. In that report, there were recommendations around deployment, training, threshold issues, accountability, internal controls, and nomenclature. In the nomenclature we're talking about, that's where we have used since that time conducted energy weapons, not tasers, not any other nomenclature. There has been other reports that the OACP has been actively engaged with throughout time, as well as being involved in multiple coroner's inquests that have supported the expansion of CEWs throughout the years. From 2005 until now, we are aware of at least 18 coroner's inquests that have made recommendations that include either introducing CEWs to policing or expanding their deployment to frontline officers. 11 of the 18 inquests recommended full deployment to all frontline police officers. It should be noted that the Police Association of Ontario, which represents frontline police personnel, has also consistently supported the expansion and availability of CEWs to all police organizations throughout the province of Ontario. That organization has similarly passed a number of resolutions over the years and has corresponded with the ministry in support of that expanded use. According to the Government of Ontario's announcement in 2014, there was approval to expanded use, and at that time the government introduced a number of changes that provided direction and guidance to when a CEW would be used, increased reporting provisions, enhanced training with the use, and the expectation that police services would engage local communities prior to deciding to expand CEW deployment. The OACP strongly supported permitting local police services to expand CEW deployment, along with a requirement for the police services to report back to their respective police service boards, and indeed the communities that they serve. I can tell you that of all the police services in the province, Toronto Police Service is the only police service that has not taken the opportunity for the expanded use and issuance of CEWs to their police personnel. I have been provided, as one of our members of the Ontario Provincial Police, with a number of statistical information with the experiences that we've had since the expanded use of CEWs throughout the province. The OPP expanded full deployment to their front line in 2014. In their study, they found that in 2016, traditional use of force was linked to 55% of all use of force related injuries, while CEWs were linked to 45% of use of force related injuries. The use of CEWs increased significantly in 2014 when the CEWs were deployed to the front line, more than 5 times the reported usage compared to 2013, but that's only normal considering the expanded use. Traditional use of force on persons decreased by 54% between 2013 and 2015. An increase in both traditional use of force and CEW use in 2016 is believed to be linked to the launch of the ministry's enhanced electronic use of force reporting in March of that year. The CEWs consistently have a superior effectiveness rate as a use of force option. Other significant provincial findings: CEWs are a highly effective use of force option. Statistics show the effectiveness rate for displayed was higher than for deployed in every year since 2011. Displayed effectiveness was consistently very high, between 87% and 93% from 2011 to 2015. The theory for decrease in displayed effectiveness of CEWs in 2016 is the recent focus on de-escalation training and tactical communication, which means the officers are more often employing verbal skills to defuse situations. Deployed effectiveness ranged from 74% to 96%. The OPP's experience with CEWs is consistent with the experiences of other police services who provided CEWs to their officers. The OACP has no knowledge of any serious injury or death which may be directly attributed to the use of CEWs as a use of force option. We are unaware of any serious increase in the number of complaints related to the abuse by police officer deploying or displaying a CEW. We are also not aware of any unsafe failures of the weapon, nor of any officer safety issues. So in conclusion, non-lethal force is and should be the standard for the use as prescribed and authorized by the ministry. The OACP also takes the position that there is a clear need to educate the public. Our communities need to understand, appreciate, and accept, while non-lethal force is the standard. While we have developed and enhanced the emphasis on de-escalation, there will be occasions when our police officers must and will use deadly force. Relatively few in numbers, these incidents, largely driven by timing and circumstances, will happen. In those cases, Ontario has a well-established and proven effective system and process of oversight. All police services in Ontario, provincial, municipal, and First Nations, are committed to ensuring the safety of the public and our police officers. In our view, CEW is a valuable, less than lethal force option that should be made available to all frontline police officers across Ontario. The fact that all frontline officers in the City of Toronto do not have this use of force option means there is currently a risk to the safety and well-being of both individuals being apprehended and the police personnel themselves. The Toronto Police Services Board has the power and authority to remedy this situation. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bain. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Collins. Dr. Collins is a clinical forensic psychiatrist and an associate professor at the University of Toronto. He has a tremendous depth of experience in the Canadian military and in policing matters, not only at the local Toronto level, but also with the RCMP, the OPP, and others across North America. He is a long-standing member of the Crisis and Hostage Negotiation Team at our service's Emergency Task Force. Dr. Collins.
Can anyone see me? This is
They moved the mic down. Perfect.
okay. Good. I don't have a prepared talk. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm an operational forensic psychiatrist with the police. Over the past 3 decades, I've assisted police in various areas, but as operational, I work in investigations, violent crime, homicides, child abductions, child pornography. This is what I've done in my career. But I've also had the interesting role, and I see it as very rewarding, as being someone who trains officers in how to de-escalate, how to negotiate with individuals who are in crisis. Now, granted, I am a medical doctor, I am a psychiatrist, but I have to say that the vast majority of individuals who have psychiatric illnesses never come into contact with the police. When I get called out by Toronto ETF, when I get called out by other tactical teams within the GTA, when I get consulted by other police agencies, one thing that we do is try and achieve the goal of resolving a situation as safely and as peacefully as we can. That's what we aim for. We spend weeks training officers to be negotiators. I'm also, as of a few years ago now, training officers in the mobile crisis intervention teams to be able to respond to calls, reassure individuals, and I use the term resolve the call without anyone getting injured. Although de-escalation is the goal, unfortunately, not everyone will respond to that type of approach. There are two people involved, sometimes more than two people. But if an individual has a major thought disorder, they may have command hallucinations, they may have delusions, they may not be responsive to de-escalation. Everyone's staring at the board. I don't want to miss out. What's happening? Nothing. Okay. All right. So, what are situations where you can't de-escalate? Those situations are when the person is so anxious or violent or so thought disordered, and unfortunately, what I've been seeing of late are individuals who have drug-induced psychosis, methamphetamine, other drugs that will give individuals chemical courage, rum courage, and will make them not receptive to establishing a rapport. The other thing that happens that I've witnessed is that individuals, a situation can change very quickly. And sometimes police will arrive and you don't have a chance to establish a rapport or enter a dialogue or use calming or active listening. I was not involved in this case, but most recently, I think it was about a month ago, there was an individual who was stabbed by a stranger in daylight in a residential area. Lots of people there responding, honking horns. Police arrived, but because they didn't have a less than lethal option, given the fact that there was an active stabber, that person was shot. Thankfully, both the victim and the individual, and I don't know what his mental state was, I don't know what his story was, both of them survived. Using less than lethal options and using the CPW, I have seen, and I've been on over 350 calls, tactical calls. I've been consulted probably over 400 times over the phone because the province, the country is big, and sometimes I only have to give advice over the phone. I can't drive there, although sometimes I have. Sometimes I've flown to other communities where there's an ongoing situation. But we have the 3 T's, and the most important T's are talk and time. Talk and time comes before the last T, which is tactics. And no one wants to use tactics that will risk injury to the individual or injury to a civilian, a bystander, or to the police. So lots has been, research has been done on the CEW. I see it as but as an option to avoid using something more serious that could be life-threatening and injurious, such as a firearm. So de-escalation, what's the message I have? We try and de-escalate, we try to negotiate, we try to communicate, we use all the skills. I teach all the skills that are available. Even when I'm in the emergency room, and I do shifts in 24-hour psychiatric emergency room, with all the skilled nurses and psych assistants and physicians, we sometimes cannot de-escalate a situation, even in a safe hospital setting. We don't have CEWs. We have, obviously, physical restraints, which is not ideal, and unfortunately, we have to use sometimes chemical restraints. Police don't have that. Police shouldn't have that. But I use that as an illustration that even with people who do this day in and day out, some individuals are not going to respond, and you have to have other options. Now, I made this short because I thought there would be a time for questions, and I was told no time for questions, but I wish there were, because I kind of based my teaching on questions from the floor. So, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Collins. Our next speaker is Ms. Dilnaz Garda. Ms. Garda is an educator and an advocate, and is the driving force behind a number of initiatives intended to promote police member wellness and safety, including Beyond the Blue, which supports police families. Ms. Garda is the sister of the late Police Constable Darius Garda, and has delivered compelling addresses to a large number of police audiences, including police recruits. Ms. Garda.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Dilnaz Garda, and this is my husband, Danny Mavro. He's a current standing officer in 55 Division. I'm the current chapter president of Toronto Beyond the Blue, an organization that is committed to providing a community of support to Toronto Police Service members and their families. I speak to you today with first-hand experience of the toll that on-the-job trauma and lethal weapons take on our officers and their families. My brother, Police Constable Darius Garda, passed away all too soon as a result of PTSD and mental health issues. Our family was, and still is, devastated, as was the entire TPS family, as they shared in our grief and mourning. My brother was funny, caring, and a loving person. He was as smart as he was witty, and he graduated from the University of Toronto, and was more proud when he graduated from the Ontario Police College. So how did my family get to this tragic point in our family story? In April 2010, my brother and several other officers were involved in a fatal incident when they shot and killed an individual. This individual refused to stop his vehicle and drove at officers, striking one of them. The SIU investigated the shooting, and all officers, including my brother, were cleared. Although my brother was cleared by the SIU, he could not clear his mind of his memories of that fateful night. After the shooting, my brother's life started to unravel. First family, then friends, then work. Unbeknownst to our family, my brother had become a person in crisis, a person suffering from mental health issues. My brother was diagnosed with PTSD, which he called a disease of the shadows, and he was absolutely correct. You see, he hid his mental health issues from everyone and anyone until he couldn't hide it any longer. But by then it was too late. My brother went to work only to be re-triggered and further traumatized. He spent every waking moment reflecting on that night. Every dream turned into a nightmare. And this ruined him and any relationship he had. This is an officer's reality. My brother suffered a moral injury, and is proof of how seriously officers take every interaction they have with the people they are sworn to serve and protect. No one is untouched by the trauma when an interaction happens that leads to a fatality, including the officer. 11 inquests have recommended the deployment of CEWs. How many more inquests will it take before we provide police with an alternate option? How many more deaths will it take before we say no more? With each struck down vote to deploy officers with this alternate, non-lethal option, as a community, I feel we are being hypocrites about the advocacy of community mental health. When our community suffers a loss, the reverberation of that loss is felt by all. Our officers aren't robots. They are living, breathing human beings who go home at night to their families. They go home to lay their head down, trying to process all the traumas of their day. We need to start looking at this issue from a proactive and holistic perspective, which includes the mental well-being of our officers. Darius's narrative is no different from any of our community members who are in crisis. My brother suffered for 4 years trying so hard to cope. Any headway he made was set back during the inquest. He could no longer hide his trauma, even 4 years after the fatal shooting. We as a community need to realize that officers are susceptible to trauma, and we need to humanize the badge or consider officers as human when making decisions. Not allowing frontline officers a CEW option allows the potential for further SIU investigations and coroner inquests. Not only is there an unnecessary possibility that the person in crisis may lose their life, it also leaves a family and community in utter devastation. And this includes the officer's colleagues, and the officer's family. If there is a safer alternative, I would go as far as to say that it is negligent not to provide this to our officers and the community which they serve. TPS is currently the only service remaining that does not equip their frontline officers with this life-saving, non-lethal use of force option. Toronto Beyond the Blue is able to serve the officers and their families who are struggling with operational stress injuries as a result of on-the-job trauma. These officers have partners, children, parents, siblings who love them and want them to remain healthy on the job. If we could provide an option, such as CEWs, that would benefit not only the person in crisis, but also the officer, an option which would allow them an opportunity to come home out of the situation unharmed, then this is an alternative that needs to be seriously considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gerda. The final presentation that we're going to present at this part of the evening is given by the team of Deputy Chief Barbara McLean and Sergeant Darren Sutcliffe. Deputy Chief McLean was appointed Deputy Chief of the Toronto Police Human Resources Command this past August. She has 28 years of experience not only in policing operations, but also in public safety, community engagement, strategic planning, and policy and leadership development. She holds master's degrees in business administration and industrial relations and human resources. She's one of the key players in the ongoing transformational change initiatives which are shared by the service and the Police Services Board. Sergeant Sutcliffe is a leader in the Toronto Police College's Defensive Tactics section. He's spent just under a third of his 30-year career in police training and has been active in internal and external consultations in the development of the police training. He's one of our experts in the training of police officers in the legal, theoretical, and practical issues surrounding the use of conductive energy weapons. Sergeant Sutcliffe is one of 4 senior master CEW trainers in Canada and one of 8 senior CEW trainers in the province of Ontario. Deputy Chief McLean, Sergeant Sutcliffe.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks very much. First of all, let me thank all of you. First, let me drop the mic. First, let me thank all of you for being here tonight, for taking time out of your schedules to hear or speak to the board on this important issue. So thank you. Tonight is about how the Toronto Police Service can strive to achieve zero death. The service believes that through proper policy, training, and accountability, the CEW is an appropriate use of force option that can help maintain public and officer safety, and it should be available to non-supervisory frontline officers. Today's presentation will advocate to increase the suite of responses to potential use of force situations. And these already include less lethal force options like the sock round, as well as other options that are being explored, the shields. We will be framing our request to expand the deployment to frontline officers within the Toronto context and our experience with the CEW over the past 10 years. Our request applies to those officers who are typically first responders to emergency or 911 calls for service that often involve higher risk, where officers need to seek a balance between using the minimal force necessary required for the circumstances and the exercise of judgment, often under great stress. Today's request is framed within and respects the following principles. The police are subject to civilian authority. We serve at the will of the public. The police must be given appropriate tools to do their jobs. The police must use the least amount of force necessary to manage the risk presented by the situation, and the force used must be proportionate to the seriousness of the situation. Use of force situations are often dynamic and sometimes require a variety of responses to address them safely. The service's request is based on the following key messages. Officers should have more options, not fewer. There's a duty to the public as well as to police officers to provide officers with a suite of responses to safely address the situations that involve the application of force. And these responses must be governed by continued emphasis on training, supervision, innovation, and accountability through public reporting. The service is committed to improving its responses so that lethal outcomes can be avoided. The service has adopted the aspirational goal of zero death when interacting with a member of the public. We believe that the CEW is a valuable use of force option that assists officers in utilizing the appropriate level of force that results in fewer officer-involved shootings and fewer injuries to members of the public and to the involved officers. The purpose of today's presentation and the service's request to expand the deployment is to provide officers with an additional option within the use of force continuum in an effort to reduce fatalities and serious injuries whenever possible. The service believes that the CEW is a bridge between threatening and assaultive situations and safety. We believe that it is a tool that has the potential to save lives. The service recognizes and is committed to the role that de-escalation plays in every encounter where it is practicable and safe to do so. In fact, through our training, we have formalized what can be considered intuitive, and we have given the art of conversation, the art of language, and of building rapport an intervention title, that of de-escalation. While we are asking that the CEW be part of the options available to our frontline officers, we recognize that it must never be used as a substitute for de-escalation. And we have come about this important emphasis from several angles. Justice Frank Iacobucci, in his independent report to the service, entitled Police Encounters with People in Crisis, recommended more emphasis on training, as did recommendation number 12 within the Police and Community Engagement Review, or the PACER report. As well, the service is currently negotiating an academic partnership through an RFP process it initiated last year as part of the planning for the way forward to further improve the training that we deliver. This slide summarizes the many sources of information, reports, academic research that support the CEW as a tool that can save lives. The CEW is one of the most studied tools by police officers, and hundreds of studies have been done all over North America, the results of which are researched and included in our training and in our procedures. In the interest of time, I will only mention a few of them. Key studies include the one conducted by Commissioner Thomas Braidwood in his report, Restoring Public Confidence, Restricting the Use of CEWs in British Columbia. And this was issued after the death of Mr. Robert Dikansky. He remarked, "I'm satisfied that on balance, our society is better off with these weapons in use than without them." He went on to further say that he would find it hard to justify recommending a restriction on the assignment of a CEW weapon if no such restriction applied to the service pistol. Similarly, Justice Frank Iacobucci, after the death of Mr. Sammy Atine, recommended, with some conditions, that being body-worn cameras, expanding the deployment of the CEW to frontline officers. There are many studies also on the medical effects of the CEW. In particular, the Gauge report entitled The Health Effects of Conducted Energy Weapons, which was published in 2013. It was considered by the Canadian Council of Academies to be one of the most comprehensive assessments of national and international evidence on the medical and psychological impacts of CEWs. Overall, the report found that CEWs are not necessarily risk-free and that further research is needed. The expert panel also found that the most common injuries from CEWs were puncture wounds from the projectile probes and concluded available studies suggest that while fatal complications are possible, they would be extremely rare. As well, an earlier study out of Calgary entitled Police and Public Interactions found that CEWs scored highly for the safety of both persons and officers in 562 use of force incidents that occurred over 2 years. The study found that the use of CEWs resulted in fewer citizen and officer injuries than either physical control or the baton. The ministry's decision was already covered by Mr. Ron Bain and Chair Pringle in his introduction, so I won't belabor it. And I will say one thing about inquest recommendations, they've been covered as well. When the ministry made its decision, it reviewed 12. There are now 18 inquest decisions that recommend or speak to the issue of CEWs. This means that since 2013, when the service first asked the board to expand CEW deployment, 6 more juries of citizens in Ontario have looked at the circumstances surrounding the deaths of members of the public and concluded that the CEW is a tool that may help prevent similar tragedies. I'm going to turn the presentation now over to Darren Sutcliffe, who will take you through the service's history, as well as the accountability mechanisms, policy training, and reporting that govern the use of CEWs by the Toronto Police Service members. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone. Great way to start. As you can see, I've been asked to give an overview of history, our training, the overview of the device, and some of the accountability aspects of it. We have already established most of the TPS experience. We have had the device in our hands since 1999. That was tactical officers. As of 2007, we included frontline supervisors or their designates. So from 2007 to 2017, we have a 10-year experience with this device. Whoop. What have we learned in this 10-year period regarding the CEW? Well, we've had over 2,800 total uses. Over 50% of the time, we had to use only demonstrated force presence. We've also noted that it was a 90% effectiveness with only 27 minor injuries. Take into account an empty hand technique, we had 310 serious injuries over that 10-year period, with 2 injuries, serious injuries with the CEW. During that same period, we had, an involved death involving empty hand techniques, 4, with the CEW, 0. Hopefully that'll pop back up in a second. The CEW is not a substitute for lethal force. However, if used in conjunction with lethal force, it may be able to alleviate the use of the firearm. The Toronto Police Service holds to the ministry in that we employ or use the CEW only during a threatening or assaultive behavior or imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death, including suicide or threat attempts, or as a way to stop a person from self-harming. Now I'm here to talk about the training aspect of it. Currently, to be a CEW instructor, you have to attend and become a use of force instructor. That's a three-week ministry course out of the Ontario Police College. Then you apply to become a CEW instructor. It's a 2-day intensive course in which you have to do teach-backs, know the device, know scenario-based training, de-escalation techniques, and be able to teach that back. That certification is only good for a 2-year period, and then you have to do it all over again. This is taught by senior instructors like myself. From that, those instructors can now go back to their service and provide a 16-hour, 2-day user course. This is 4 hours longer than the ministry standard. It is also based on scenario-based training and exercises. We emphasize the appropriate use of the CEW, not just how to use it, but where to place the probes to have an effective deployment on the person that is still safe for them and still provides the response that the police are requiring. We focus on sound judgment, i.e. the ability to explain actions prior to using force and articulating the use of force after the incident has occurred, and whether that use of force was appropriate or something else could have been done. We have a main focus on de-escalation and negotiation as a primary means of resolving conflict. And this officer has to recertify yearly as part of their use of force training. Finally, we are currently using a device that is smarter than any other previous device that we've used. It has half the electrical charge. But the most important part is the tracking availability. It provides pulse logs and event logs. So as the device comes out of the holster and is engaged, the safety is engaged, it starts creating and collecting data about everything that device is doing at that time. Whether the trigger's been pulled, what type of cartridge is in there, how long the cycle was it safe, the weapon safe again. It also provides a pulse log which will indicate whether or not, if the device has been fired, whether or not it's hit a conductive target. These are all ways in which we can take a look at the deployment and see whether or not it was a valid one or not. Take into account, you use those logs in addition to the CW reports and the reviews. After each and every CW use to submit, officers are required to submit a report, a use of force report as well as their notes and a CW report. These reports are reviewed by their direct supervisor, through their unit commander, and then sent to the Toronto Police College for the use of force analyst and myself to take a look at. We look at every CEW usage and check to see that it falls within policy and procedure. We also produce, at the end of the year, a board report for every exposure or every use of the CEW, which goes to the board and the Toronto Police Services Board, or command of the Toronto Police Services Board. And lastly but not least, we also daily do a quality and risk management aspect. Officers are required to do a daily testing of that device before the device goes out onto the road. There is also a preset audit for all devices to be downloaded and reviewed to make sure that policy and procedure has been met with that device. and to ID any breach of the law or policy and training concerns, whether that becomes a training issue or a discipline issue. And that is done, well, we've got a process going now to get it quarterly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, just to recap, you've heard about the experience across Ontario, and that the Toronto Police Service is one of the last large police services yet to be approved for non-supervisory frontline use of the CEW. You've heard about the personal impact on an officer when a life is taken. We've also heard about the times when de-escalation may not be well received and therefore not have the intended impact. You've heard that the training delivered by the Toronto Police Service is well regarded and goes beyond the provincial standard. And you've heard that notwithstanding this training, we still find ourselves involved in situations where we need to use force to ensure public safety. As such, you have also heard about the service's governance, review, and reporting of CEW incidents. In summary, the service's request to expand the deployment of the CEW to frontline officers is based on research and reports that have studied the CEW, the increasing number of coroner's inquest recommendations, and our experience over the last 10 years. The service is respectfully requesting that the deployment of the CEW be expanded to frontline priority response officers. The service intends to present a recommendation to procure the purchase of additional CEWs to equip non-supervisory personnel at a future board meeting. In closing, it is important to remember that today's request is not being made in isolation. Rather, the entire Toronto Police Service is undergoing transformation to achieve the goals of being where the public needs the service the most, to increase our capacity through enhancing our partnerships, and addressing the complex needs of a large city. This means that every corner of our organization is being modernized, from human resources services to how we use technology, to how we engage in partnerships, to the services that we deliver to our communities and our neighborhoods. All of these efforts are focusing our organization and our members on community-centric service delivery. In closing, the service believes that the CEW, considering the level of training and the mandated standards as regulated by the province, makes police officers better equipped to ensure public safety and will result in fewer officer-involved shootings and fewer injuries to members of the public and the officers themselves, and will help us to achieve our goal of zero death.